This is Editor Mad from the future. Probably see that this is a long video, and I don't normally put like content warnings or anything in here, but I'm gonna give a warning. I'm talking about, as you can see from the title, the Poppy War, but this review is sort of less of a review and more of a discussion on some of the historical events that inspired the Poppy War, and I thought this discussion was important because this is a book that I've seen frequently accused of having essentially gratuitously graphic and violent content, and I firmly disagree, and I think it's therefore important to talk about what Kuang was pulling from. There is going to be a moment in this video where I give you a warning that I'm going to be detailing out some particularly disturbing content, and I give you a time code so that you can skip it. I put that bit in black and white so that you can see, like, maybe if my time code is off by a couple, like, frames, just wait for me to not be in black and white and I won't be talking, or I won't be reading this particular from the time account. I also apologize for any and all noise from this one, which you can probably hear now, and which you will definitely hear at points in the video. She was like eating a bone right near me, so I apologize for that. Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. You're kind of sitting at a strange angle right now because I actually have my computer plugged in. That's what I use to record with because I don't have fancy camera equipment, but there we go. And you're also going to be seeing me drinking quite a lot of coffee in this because your girl didn't get to sleep until nearly 2 a.m. last night because her brain wouldn't shut up. You might wonder why that is. Let me tell you. It's because I finally got my ass in gear and read The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. I remember when this book came out. What was it? 2019? 2018, 2019 this book came out? Yeah. I remember because I was super intrigued. I remember because first I saw that cover. And the cover is one of the most beautiful covers I've ever seen. It is very aesthetic, gorgeous. It's drawing upon a style of ink painting that I love. It's so pretty. And I was like, ooh, interesting. And then I started seeing some of the blurbs of what they were saying this book was, which was basically it was going to be a grim, dark fantasy, inevitably a trilogy, that was based upon the Second Sino-Japanese War and the rise of Mao Zedong. Sign me the fuck up. Like, I'm here for it. And in terms of an overall review, it's from this book alone. I have not read the rest of the trilogy yet, so I really just want to talk about the Poppy War. This book is a masterpiece. Like, it's so fucking good from the get-go. I do believe that R.F. Kuang, if she hasn't gotten, like, her PhD, she's working on it or something, but she had written, like, research papers or dissertations on various aspects of the Second Sino-Japanese War, and so she's extremely familiar with the content she's riffing on, and it shows in the way that she utilizes it to tell this fantasy story that is extremely dark. And I loved how every character, there wasn't a focus on, like, is this character likable? I think of what I was saying when I read the Conqueror's Saga by Kirsten White, where the character of Lada, who was kind of like a female version of Vlad the Impaler, she was not necessarily likable. And Kirsten White had been very honest about that. Like, she said, I was writing an unlikable heroine. And I was like, Lada may not be likable, but I liked her. And it's the same thing here. Rin, our female protagonist, may not to some people be likable. She is very tough. She is extremely angry. She has a tendency to make rash decisions and make mistakes and all these things, and so she can come across as unlikable. But I like her. I think I've realized with these unlikable, especially female protagonists, they tend to be like really angry characters. I'm like, I don't know what that says about me as a person, but I like angry female protagonists who are more than willing to burn the world down to achieve what they want. And Rin is very much that. But what's interesting about that is every aspect of her anger, these things that would be seen as negative traits about her, are based in very understandable human emotions, human experience. She forms her values and her morals based upon her own personal experiences, which I like. It does mean that she's able to absorb new information and change certain things about her viewpoints based upon what she experiences, which again, I like. And even though she makes a lot of mistakes, and does some things that could be seen as genuinely horrifying, which I will get to in a second because there's a reason I want to talk about this book, beyond the fact that I love it. Even though she does this, it's one of those things where I'm like, I don't dislike her for it. In fact, I understand her for it. Which, I mean, she's not a character you would easily objectively kind of want to defend at times, but I will go to bat for this girl while acknowledging she makes mistakes. And I'm curious, I'm excited to read the rest of the trilogy, so I need to read The Dragon Republic and The Burning God. Because it's pretty clear that Rin is this Mao Zedong character, and I'm like, that's an interesting legacy you have there to deal with. So I'm very curious to read what R.F. Kuang does with this character and what exactly she's going to do. Nobody spoil me. I haven't read it. I have avoided spoilers like the plague. So, like, if you guys have read the rest of the trilogy, please don't tell me. Like, I don't want to know. I really, truly want to go into this blind, which is what I did into the Poppy War. All I knew was what I remembered when it was first coming out. Now, after I finished the Poppy War, I scanned some reviews, like found booktubers who I liked, who'd read it, you know, was reading through Goodreads, other things, and there was a consistent theme to these reviews. And almost all of them were positive. The few people who, you know, didn't like the book or weren't so positive, I should rephrase, who weren't so positive, it wasn't that they didn't like the book, it was that they had a hard time handling the graphic content of the book. Now, the graphic nature of this novel, and I'm pretty sure probably for the whole series, has been talked about. I've now discovered it is a thing. People talk about, like, just how violent these books are, how dark they are, how intense they are. And it is what you would call violence or graphic depictions of violence and gore and death and plenty of other things with a purpose. There's a reason for it. And the common theme I saw was mainly that people were utterly shocked at the level of just how graphic really everything was. Now, when I read it, knowing that I only went in knowing what I remembered from when it first came out, I really wasn't that shocked. Like, at all. I really wasn't. Probably for some basic reasons, which is one, I was going into this knowing it is a grimdark adult fantasy. Like, grimdark alone, even if you don't know the exact natures of sort of like the hallmarks of that subgenre of fantasy, like, grim and dark are two words that aren't gonna make you think you're gonna be waltzing through the flowers here. Like, of course it's gonna be dark, it's going to be graphic, it's going to be violent, it's going to be intense. Not only that, it is inspired by / riffing on the Second Sino-Japanese War. And I've come to the conclusion I must just be an asshole who remembers too much from world history class. Because when you tell me you're going to do the Second Sino-Japanese War, there's one big event that springs to mind, and of course, R.F. Kuang does in fact riff on this event. It is in the now kind of infamous Chapter 21. If you go and look up reviews for this, you will see probably a laundry list of content warnings. Almost all of them take place within Chapter 21. It is kind of now infamous that, like, yeah, it's dark, it's an intense book, and then you hit Chapter 21 and, like, people go apoplectic. They're like, oh my god, it suddenly gets so intense and so graphic. And I'm like, yes, it is a particularly graphic and intense chapter, and it is horrifying, it's meant to be. But again, I wasn't that shocked because it is, as I said, riffing on this one event from the Second Sino-Japanese War that I know, because when you tell me it's Second Sino-Japanese War, this is the one event that springs to mind because it was a genocide. For those who don't know, I'm talking about the Rape of Nanking. Nanking is also sometimes called Nanking. I don't know Chinese, I don't understand the complexities of the various, like, aspects of Chinese language, so if anybody wants to explain to me how Nanting and Nanking are interchangeable, at least in English, if that relates to the language, or if just white people are dumb, that's fine. I would actually like to know that. For all intents and purposes, I will be calling it Nanting because that's what I learned it as. The Rape of Nanking it's kind of called the Forgotten Holocaust of World War II. So the Second Sino-Japanese War is taking place predominantly in the 1930s, so we're talking very early World War I, and we're talking pre-Pearl Harbor. And this is in the Pacific conflict, so this is the Imperial Japanese Army. The Second Sino-Japanese War was basically Imperial Japan saying, we're going to take over China. Like, we want it, we're gonna take it. And they took quite a bit of it. So the rape of Nanking was 6 weeks, in which, this is the point where you're probably gonna get me sighing and pausing a lot, because this is a pretty dark topic. Within 6 weeks, scholars estimate the Imperial Japanese Army murdered anywhere between 40,000 and 300,000 disarmed Chinese combatants and innocent civilians, from children to the elderly. Really, I mean, en masse, without prejudice. It's a horrifying statistic. You might wonder why that statistic is actually so, like, large. I mean, that's a big range. We're still talking large numbers, but the difference between 40,000 and 300,000 is 260,000 people. That's a lot of people. There's a reason for this. There's a reason we don't have an accurate head count for the number of fatalities during the rape of Nanking. That is because, one, after Japan surrendered in 1945, the Japanese military immediately both designated a lot of their files secret and, like, hid them, or they destroyed them. So any of the documents we would really want from the Imperial Japanese Army on that topic, kind of in the wind. Number one. Number two comes down to the method of body disposal used by the Imperial Japanese Army, and that was burning bodies en masse, burying bodies in mass graves, and throwing bodies into the Yangtze River. So we can't get an accurate head count. I do believe, from what I've understood of what I've done of reading after having read the book, to refresh myself to make sure I was remembering this properly, I pretty much was. Scholars agree it is probably towards the upper end of that number. Like, we're closer to 300,000 than we are to 40,000. And that's not counting all of the mass rape and the looting and the desecration, mutilation of bodies. What does this have to do with Chapter 21? Like I said, Chapter 21 is riffing on this. In Chapter 21, Rin and her fellows come across a village that has been massacred by the Federation, by the enemy, basically. And they say there are, like, bodies littered everywhere, and they describe in pretty reasonably graphic detail what this city looks like, which is like a hellhole, a hellscape of death. And the reason I say, as horrifying as it is, I wasn't shocked, is because I'm telling you, the actual history is so much worse. It is so much worse. Now, like I said, what happened in Nanking took place over 6 weeks. It actually fits the definition of a genocide because the Japanese had taken Nanking. They won, and nobody was unsure they were going to win, and yet for 6 weeks they continued this onslaught of torture and murder upon the citizens of Nanking. It was so bad, okay, that the few Westerners who were there in Nanking got involved. And this includes a guy who was in the Nazi Party. Okay, look, Germany and Japan were allies. And there was his name was John Rabe, R-A-B-E. I really don't know German that well. And he was a member of the Nazi Party. And he was so horrified at what he was seeing the Japanese army do that he worked really hard to establish what was known as the Nanking Safe Zone. And he created it kind of under the guise of, hey, you have a lot of Westerners here. Now remember, this is the 1930s. The Japanese have not yet attacked Pearl Harbor. So he was like, you know, you have Americans and you have other allied forces. Like, if you kill them, you're going to be in a lot of hot water. Nobody's really ready for the Americans to get involved or all of these other people. Like, we're not ready for that yet. So he established what was known as the Nanking Safe Zone. It was predominantly where, like, all the Westerners were kind of hanging out, but they would also have a bunch of, if Chinese civilians were within there, they were safe. Like, supposedly, theoretically, the Japanese army couldn't go in there and do anything. So he was crucial in the establishment of that. Not only that, I can't believe I'm praising a Nazi. This guy used his status in the Nazi Party as a Nazi to go to the Japanese military and be like, hey, like, you need to stop what you're doing. Like, can you stop what you're doing? And basically would find ways to delay them, if not get them to stop, but in causing those delays within the army where they would all kind of have to stop what they were doing, in those periods, he would then help usher tons of civilians either into the safe zone or out of Nanjing, and they do estimate he probably saved like hundreds of thousands of lives doing this. Again, I can't believe I'm praising a guy who was in the Nazi Party, but I mean, I guess when he eventually went back to Germany, he wrote a letter to Hitler saying, like, you need to know what's going on, or what went on in Nanjing. Like, you need to talk to the Japanese about this. And he got arrested by the Gestapo, and they interrogated him. I can't believe I just spoke well of a guy who was in the Nazi Party. The other major Western figure who was there was actually an American missionary. He was Episcopalian, I believe. He was, you know, a reverend / missionary minister, and he was there. And he was obviously within the safe zone, but he, with really not caring about his own life and safety, would leave the safe zone and he would take cameras. He had a film camera and he was taking photographs to show what was happening in Nanjing. And like, the stuff he captured, it's horrifying. There's really no other way to put it. But it was valuable footage. It was so valuable that tons of countries were trying to buy that footage from him. And actually, John McGee said, no, I really want to make sure this ends up going to the right person. In fact, he never sold it in his lifetime. He gave it to his son, and his son held on to it until like 2002. And in 2002, I think he heard that, you know, in Nanjing they were going to be doing a memorial, a museum, something, and so then he turned over all the footage to them. I debated doing this, but I've decided I'm going to do it. I'm going to read to you a portion of a letter that was written by a German, like, diplomat, foreign minister, somebody, describing a scene that he saw in John McGee's footage. I'm going to be doing this for a reason. One is I really don't think just giving numbers and such can help anybody understand how severe this was, how horrifying it was, and the most tragic part of it is it was sort of forgotten, or just nobody talked about it for the longest time. Part of that is that the victims who survived the incident kind of didn't talk about it. But it is also one of those things where I go, when people are so shocked at the level of, you know, graphic content in the Poppy War, I sit back and remember this and go, kind of, this is nothing. Like, this is nothing compared to what actually was happening. So in a way, I'm doing this as a comparative to do it sort of to help anybody understand, like, this is what she pulled from. And as brutal as what she wrote is, this is infinitely worse. And I thought she did a brilliant job of taking an extremely sensitive issue and riffing on it in her novel, and doing so in a way where you get the impact of the event. And it will shock and horrify you, as it should. But it's still not as bad as what really happened. I'm going to preface this saying this is extremely graphic content that I'm about to read. And if you really think you might not be able to handle it, I will put a time code down here for when I finish this reading. Okay. So what I'm reading now was from the legation secretary of the German embassy. His name was Rosen, and he's writing about something he saw in a film that had been made, as I said, by John McGee. I'll also apologize in advance for any mispronunciations, and there are a couple dated terms in here, so forgive me for that. I am just reading verbatim. During the Japanese reign of terror in Nanking, which, by the way, continues to this day to a considerable degree, the Reverend John McGee, a member of the American Episcopal Church Mission who has been here for almost a quarter of a century, took motion pictures that eloquently bear witness to the atrocities committed by the Japanese. One will have to wait and see whether the highest officers in the Japanese army succeed, as they have indicated, in stopping the activities of their troops, which continue even today. On December 13th, about 30 soldiers came to a Chinese house at number 5 Hisinglu Ku in the southeastern part of Nanking and demanded entrance. The door was opened by the landlord, a Mohammedan named Ha. They killed him immediately with a revolver, and also Mrs. Ha, who knelt before them after Ha's death, begging them not to kill anyone else. Mrs. Ha asked them why they killed her husband, and they shot her. Mrs. Xia was dragged out from under a table to the guest hall, where she had tried to hide with her 1-year-old baby. After being stripped and raped by 1 or more men, she was bayoneted in the chest and then had a bottle thrust into her vagina. The baby was killed with a bayonet. Some soldiers then went to the next room, where Mrs. Xia's parents, aged 76 and 74, and her 2 daughters, aged 16 and 14, were. They were about to rape the girls when the grandmother tried to protect them. The soldiers killed her with a revolver. The grandfather grasped the body of his wife and was killed. The 2 girls were then stripped, the elder being raped by 2 to 3 men, and the younger by 3. The older girl was stabbed afterwards, and a cane was rammed into her vagina. The younger girl was bayoneted also, but was spared the horrible treatment that had been meted out to her sister and mother. The soldiers then bayoneted another sister of between 7 to 8, who was also in the room. The last murders in the house were of Ha's 2 children, aged 4 and 2 respectively. The older was bayoneted and the younger split down through the head with a sword. I kind of don't have words for what I just read. It's horrifying. It's inhuman, because I can understand death and conflict. Thoughts on wars and conflicts aside, I can understand when it is people who are fighting each other. But when you go to innocent, uninvolved people, and you're talking a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, an 8-year-old, 14 and 16-year-old girls, elderly couples, you rape, mutilate, and murder them in cold blood for no reason. You've won. You've taken the city. This was December 13th. That was the day they officially took Nanjing. And that letter that Rosen was writing was in February. It was still happening, he writes in his letter. In February. It had been almost 2 months. And this kind of behavior persisted. There's a point where you just are no longer human. And that is why when people are apoplectic and just in shock over, wow, how could Kuang write something so graphic? How could she write something so dark? And wow, this violence seems gratuitous. It seems excessive. Excessive? How about you crack open a history book and you tell me what she wrote was excessive? This is what she was basing it on. In comparison to what actually happened, she's almost fucking tame. And in case anybody was curious about the attitudes of the Japanese on this event, this is a really fraught area of discussion. While most Japanese, even veterans, people who were even there, say, yeah, the massacre happened, it is often played down. They don't usually talk about just how bad it was. And there's now even, rather like you'd see with the Nazi Holocaust, there are deniers of the Nanjing Holocaust. Which I just sit there in disbelief. I'm like, there is video and photograph evidence. There are victims. You can't talk your way out. I'll never understand history deniers. Another big thing that gets talked about in this book, with regards to this first book at least, is the aspect of human experimentation and essentially a whole nother genocide that is committed by the main character. The human experimentation is, again, based on fact. It was called Unit 731. It was basically like Japan's version of the Holocaust experiments, where they were taking Chinese innocents and civilians and performing human experiments on them. It was their attempt to develop chemical and biological warfare, and so they used the Chinese populace as their test subjects. So, no, again, that is not being dark for the sake of being dark. It happened. I don't know how much information is readily available about what was going on in Unit 731. Again, as I mentioned before, the Japanese army, you know, when they surrendered in 1945, had a habit of destroying or hiding their records. So, yeah, there's that. And so as a result, our character, Rin, when she sees all this going on, she quite literally uses this shamanism, this shamanistic power that she has to destroy an island of people. Which, I mean, I could say there are parallels to the atomic bomb in that, but it's like, when she does it, admittedly, this is where I say she's not necessarily likable, but I like her. I think there was a part of me that was very affected by what I'd been reading. Again, as somebody who also knew some of the history that was behind this, I was like, I kind of get it. Do I approve of it necessarily? It depends. Am I talking in the real world or the fictional world? In the fictional world, I'm just like, burn them all. I'm kind of a vicious shit when I read things. But in the case of, like, were this reality, I'd be like, maybe we shouldn't commit genocide. Look, I just felt like I needed to rant only because I think I got very frustrated by a lot of the reviews that I saw of people saying that the violent, like, this book is, you know, overly dark, the violence is gratuitous, that it is just so much. And I'm like, is it really though? Like, compared to, like, it is made very clear when you go into this book, it, you know, in all of the press and all the promotion, everything about this book said we are basing our conflict upon the Second Sino-Japanese War. Okay. I don't know about you guys, but I did take world history in high school. Like, it was a required course. We talked about the Second Sino-Japanese War because it's part of World War II, which is, you know, kind of an important event that you study. So I went in expecting this to be dark. And again, even if I didn't know that, I'm like, it's a grim, dark fantasy. Grim, dark fantasy tends to be very graphic. It doesn't like to pull its punches. That's kind of the point of the subgenre in many ways. It frustrates me when people come for this book calling it gratuitously violent, when I sit here and I'm like, it's really not. Like, all of the violence has a purpose. She's playing upon actual historical events, and sure, she is telling a fantasy story, but she's basing it pretty hard on a reality for millions upon millions of people. That being said, yes, this is a dark and a violent book. It is, without question, graphic in nature. Be shocked, be horrified, it is dark content, but to the level of, like, just the reactions that I've seen, I just find it surprising. I do admit that, again, I'm sitting here, as I say, feeling like an asshole who maybe knows too much, because I remember when we studied the Second Sino-Japanese War. The incident of the Rape of Nanking is something that had affected me greatly when we learned about it. I was like, why, like, everybody knows about the Holocaust. Why had I never heard about this until I was sitting in school? Part of the tragedy is that nobody really talked about the Nanking Massacre until around, like, the 1990s. There is, I will recommend, a really, really good book called The Rape of Nanking. I will link it down below. If you are an Audible member, you can get it for free. It's in the Plus library. And everything else does admittedly come a little bit from my own interest. But okay, so stepping aside from my arguments about how I will go blue in the face defending the level of violence in this book, which sounds terrible, I know, but I will go blue in the face till defending the violence in this book. Yes, there is a laundry list of content warnings. If you really are if you are somebody who does get triggered by some of these things, if you are truly concerned, yes, please go look up what, like, content warnings you can find for this book. Know that, like, 95% of them are pretty much contained within one chapter. But that this is a pretty, I don't know if I'd call it bleak, but it is a dark and grim, it's a grim, dark story. I can kind of already tell the other two books are gonna like shatter me emotionally. And nobody tell me, but I have a sneaking suspicion one or all of our main characters are going to be dead by the end of it. I honestly think Rin is going to be dead by the end of it. I'm calling it now. We'll see how right I am when I actually get to the burning cottage.